Good Woche and guten Chaneke. The Rebbe soll gesund sein began the Farbrengen this afternoon that it is a regular Shabbos Mevorchim Farbrengen based on the instruction of the Friedike Rebbe to have a Farbrengen every Shabbos Mevorchim. However, together with it, it is also Shabbos Chaneke. And the Gemara in Zvachim tells us that when a korban tamid, which this is the daily korban which they brought every day of the week in the Beis HaMikdash, when this tamid was brought on a yontif, or on a Shabbos, or on a Rosh Chodesh, the korban tamid was also elevated on that day. In other words, being that this is a special day, and it's a special day which calls for special korbanos, so even the korban which was brought every single day of the week is also looked upon different. The Gemara uses the expression ahane. It helps and it has an effect also on the korban tamid which is brought on that day. Memela, though today on one hand it's a regular Shabbos Mevorchim Farbrengen, however, being that it is a Shabbos Mevorchim that falls out together with Shabbos Chaneke, so Shabbos Chaneke, so to speak, elevates this Shabbos, gives an additional maila, gives something in addition, raises it in the eichos, in the quality, in the spiritual quality of this Shabbos is raised through the fact that it is Shabbos Chaneke. And Chaneke, the Rebbe goes on, is something extremely special. On one hand, it's special because we say Halal Chaneke. Chaneke two inyanim happened. Number one, it's the Nitzachon HaMilchama, the fact that we succeeded over the Yevonim. Number two, it is also the Nes that happened with the Pach Shel Shemen, that a little bit of oil was found, and this oil lasted, instead of for 1 day, it lasted for 8 days. The inyan that we say Halal for 8 days of Yontef is not because of the first Nes of Nitzachon HaMilchama of succeeding the Yevonim, because if for that Nes we wouldn't say Halal 8 days, that's enough to celebrate 1 day. The fact that we're saying Halal 8 days, this in itself shows that this is the celebration of the Nes with the Pach Shemen, that the oil for the menorah, which was sufficient normally only for 1 day, and it lasted for 8 days. The inyan of saying Halal and the whole Halal, Gans Halal, is also something which we find not only on Chanukah. This is something which we find, as the Alter Rebbe in the Siddur gives a simin, Bibetach. These are the days that we recite the whole Halal. However, Bibetach stands for, the Ches is the 8 days of Chanukah, the Tes is the 9 days of Sukkot, and twice Beis, that's the 2 days of Shavuos and the 2 days of Pesach. Because later, Chalamayit Pesach and the last days of Pesach, we don't recite the whole Halal. So it's a Rosh Tevis, a siman of Beis, Tes, Ches, of the days that we recite the whole Halal on. However, Chanukah possesses within itself something even more than the fact that we recite the whole Halal on Chanukah. And this is what Chazal tell us, that the Rebbe has pledged that these Neiros Chanukah will remain something eternal. And this is the specialty what Chanukah possesses within itself. And this is something unique which other days when the entire Halal is recited does not possess such a uniqueness within that day. This is something whereby HaKadosh Baruch Hu pledged, though the Neiros HaMikdash are not eternal, this is something which after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, unfortunately, we cannot any longer fulfill. However, the inyan of Neiros Chanukah, this is something which the Rabbeinu Shalom has pledged to us, that HaNeiros Halalu Einam B'Teilam La'Eilam, this is something which we will have eternal. But the Geya all are the Yomim Tovim. Chazal tell us that the Yomim Tovim will become Batul Asad Loving. The Rebbe says there are many interpretations in it. There's one interpretation that claims it doesn't mean Chas v'Shalom we will not have the Yomim Tovim. It means that in days when Mashiach will come, the Yomim Tovim will be like Kishraga B'Tiyara, like a light middle of the afternoon. In other words, it will not offer too much because the days in itself, every Vachadik day, every simple day, after the coming of Mashiach will be a special and great day. But mainly the Yomim Tovim are not going to add on too much on top of that. However, irregardless how we're going to teach, which is something the Rebbe says he doesn't want to get into at this point, but this is Kulal Memeide, everyone does agree to it, that Chazal tell us that Chanukah is a yontif which Haneres Halalu Eina B'Teilam Leilam, it's an eternal yontif. Memela, based on the instruction of the Frierdiker Rebbe, that Chassidische Farbrengen is always supposed to bring fruitful results. And the results have to be such that have to be brought down into action, not just theoretic in Yonim, but in Yonim which have to have an effect in the Yonim of Ha'maisa Hu Ha'ika. Therefore the Rebbe says, the results that come of a Chanukah Farbrengen also have to be such type of results that the Inyanim will remain eternal. In other words, not just Tam Inyanim which we accept upon ourselves to do things and the effect will remain only Toich Kedei Dibur, which is very, very, very short effect. Or even Mahalech of a Shir of a Mahalech of several mil. But here we're talking about a completely different Inyan. We're talking about such days when we are given special koiches to accept upon ourselves inyanim which will also be of such that einam b'teilam li'olam inyanim that will remain eternal. Memela, we have to understand that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu demands these inyanim, He as well gives koiches for such inyanim. And these are the special koiches that are given in Shabbos Chanukah. The Gemara tells us B'negei Chanukah, Gemara Masechta Shabbos, where the Gemara discusses the details of Chanukah, that what is the time, when is the time one shall light the Neiris Chanukah? Gemara says, Mishatishka hachama adekalye riglo de tomedoi, that we are permitted the proper time to light the Chanukah candles is from sunset, Mishatishka hachama, and the Gemara uses the expression ad dekalye riglo de tomedoi. Who is Talmudoi? The Rebbe says there are various interpretations in the Mefarshei HaMishnah who means Talmudoi. Some that claim that this was a segment of people that they were slaves to Shlomo HaMelech. Others that give him a different type of description. However, this was some sort of a separate tribe who we refer to as Talmudoi. And these Talmudoi, these people, it seems like they were late walkers in the street. The Gemara tells us, until what time are we allowed to light Chanukah candles? Adekalye. No, it doesn't have to burn until that time. Until what time is it permitted to tzindon if somebody wasn't home earlier? Adekalye. Yes. Adekalye rigla de Talmudoi. Until the Talmudoi people will not walk in the streets anymore. That's the Pashat Pshat in Gemara. The Rebbe says each and every word in Chazal is extremely accurate. And when Chazal want to express themselves and give us a proper time until when it is permitted to light Chanukah candles, why is it that the Gemara selected this expression, the kalye riglo de Talmudoi, that those who are Talmudois will no longer be walking the streets? And the Rebbe explains as follows. Talmudoi is composed. Is composed from the same lettering as a moired, as one who rebels. In Hebrew, moired means to rebel. What is the pshat? Kal yoriglo de Talmudoi. The idea and the goal, the ultimate goal of the Neiris Chanukah is to see to it that the one who until now was considered one who rebels in the Rabbeinu Shalom will no longer be walking the street. What's the pshat? Will no longer be walking the street? Rebbe says it's not our inyan, not the kavanah of Neiris Chanukah to destroy people, chas v'shalom. However, the kavanah of Neiris Chanukah is to see to it that he will no longer be walking the street. Where will he be? He will come into a house. What's the pshat? The street reflects the concept, Rishus HaRabim reflects the concept of a hefkeres. Person not having any closeness to Torah, not having any closeness to Rabbeinu Shalom, so where is he? He's roaming the streets. What is the ufta of Neiris Chanukah? To get him off the streets. When Neiris Chanukah, the idea of it is to accomplish that the one who until now was considered a Talmud, he's a Moired Ba'HaKadosh Baruch Hu, rebels in the Rebishter. However, as of now, this individual is gotten completely off the street, and we got him word into the Beis HaMedrash. And the Rebbe stresses again, every word of Chazal is accurate. Chazal say, express themselves, ad the kalye riglo de Talmudoi. In other words, what does the regel stand for? The regel is the foot. Foot stands for the lowest madrega of a person. Naturally, the highest stage of a person is the moyach, the roish, and the regel is the contrary to the moyach. Here Chazal tell us that even the furthest extent of this person, we were successful in getting his roish off the street. However, his leiv off the street. However, the goal of Neiras Chanukah is that this moired should be gotten totally off the street, even his regel as well. And here we see how everything is extremely accurate in Chazal. Chazal expressed himself when they want to give us some sort of a definition about till what time we're allowed to put on the Chanukah licht. Chazal could have given any other type of description. However, Chazal have instilled in these words the entire goal of Neiras Chanukah as well. That the whole idea of Chanukah is to make lichtig the outside the street, which reflects outside to Yiddishkeit, outside to Torah. Something which is completely the opposite. We're talking about a person who is a moired, he rebels. Rebbe explained, when we're talking about somebody who rebels, Pshat is he does it even without any reason, without any logic. In the Torah it says one way, he will go ahead and do differently. Torah says, Rebbe brought an example, Torah says, Dvar Hashem is halacha, he will go ahead and do the opposite, do the contrary. What is a person like that considered? He's a moired, he's one that rebels without any reason, without any logic, without any understanding. He goes openly against Torah. And the whole idea of Chanukah is to take this individual, to reach even to such an individual and get him totally off the street. Even his regel, the lowest madrega of that person, should be totally off the street and bring it into Kedusha. Shabbos Mevorchem Tevis always falls out during Chanukah. However, it varies which day of Chanukah Shabbos Mevorchem Tevis falls out. For example, this year, we are on the third day of Chanukah. If we look into Kriyas HaTorah of the third day of Chanukah, the Kriyah of Chanukah, which we read in the Torah in Shul every morning, is about the Nesiim, regarding the Nesiim. What we read about today is about, this morning, is about the Nasi of Shevet Zvul. Sequence goes, first day of Chanukah we read about the Nasi of Shevet Yehuda, who was Nachshon ben Aminadav. Then afterwards we read about Shevet Yisachar, and then we come to Shevet Zvul. And actually, it is Yisachar and Zvul that compose the two major segments among Yid. Yisachar, his inyan is learning Torah, and Zvul, his inyan is he supports Yisachar, and at the same time he's heavily involved in Ma'aseh HaMitzvahs, in the fulfilling of the mitzvahs. And these are the two major components, Torah and mitzvahs. However, all this can be successful when it comes with an introduction of a Nachshon ben Aminadav. What is Nachshon ben Aminadav noted for? He was the one that jumped into the sea when it was needed by Kriyas Yamsuf. Rebishta said, Daber al b'nei Yisrael v'yisod, the Yidden had a sea ahead of them, in front of them, the Mitzrim were in back of them. The Yidden didn't know what type of miracle HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to do, that he's going to split the sea, make the sea dry. Nachshon ben Aminadav heard that the Rebishta said, Daber al b'nei Yisrael v'yisod, what he immediately did was, he jumped into the sea. In other words, the source of Mesiras Nefesh is Nachshon ben Aminadav. However, this inyan of Mesiras Nefesh by Yidden can be reflected in two ways. There are those that have to utilize the Mesiras Nefesh in the area of Yisachar, as far as dedicating themselves to learning of Torah, and there are those that have to come on to the Nachshon ben Aminadav Mesiras Nefesh when we're talking about their derech and avodas Hashem as a zvul. They are heavily involved as Balei Asakim. They are involved in business, they are merchants. However, from them too it is required the total dedication, the total Mesiras Nefesh in the avodas Hashem in their areas, as far as supporting Yisachar, and as far as fulfilling the Ma'aseh HaMitzvahs, which is an equal requirement from a Yisachar as well as from a Zavul. It was here later in the Sikha where the Rebbe quoted the Minchas Elazar. Minchas Elazar was a Munkacher Rebbe, he was a Rebbe in Hungary. And by many Farbrengens, the Rebbe quotes the Minchas Elazar. There was a very close friendship between the Minchas Elazar and the Frierdiker Rebbe. And it is at many issues that the Rebbe quotes him at various Farbrengens. Today the Rebbe quoted him how he writes in his correspondence, in his shuvas, in his letters. The Rebbe added on that he was a person that he really expressed very freely and very bluntly whatever he wanted to express at whatever the occasion may have been. And here he was corresponding to a Yidden that lived in Eretz Yisrael at that time, and he was writing to him regarding Bias HaMashiach. And regarding Bias HaMashiach, he writes in his letter that Yidden have to have Mesiras Nefesh for the coming of Mashiach. The Rebbe says we recite daily in davening as Samach David Avdecha, and during the weekdays when we say it, Shabbos that we don't say as Samach David Avdecha, however we say V'sachzena ineinu b'shufcha l'tzion berachmim. So constantly we are begging from the Rebbeinu Shalom that the Rebbe should bring Mashiach. So the Munkacher writes in his letter that Yidden have to demand Mashiach from the Rebbe to such an extent to be willing to have Mesiras Nefesh for the coming of Mashiach. Later in the Farbrengen, Rebbe spoke behemshech to an Indian which he spoke previously in the Yutas Kislev Dike Farbrengen as well as last week. This is the Indian that any Mesechta or any Indian has to be, the ending of it has to be with an Indian Shal Shalom, with a good Indian, Mesayim and B'toiv. Whenever we finish any type of Indian, the Siyam also always has to be discussing a good Indian. And here the Rebbe quoted a Masechta. Masechta finishes, Eis Lasis Lashem Hefeiru Teirasecha. There's a pasuk that when it's an Eis Lasis Lashem, it's a time to do things for the Eibishter. Hefeiru Teirasecha, we overlook even an Indian which is discussed in Torah. This pasuk is quoted very often b'negei the Indian of Torah Shebal Peh. We know that there's the written Torah and there's the oral Torah. So at the time, the oral Torah was something which was memorized Bal Peh and was never put into writing. However, when Chachamim realized that there's a chance that this Torah should Chas v'Shalom be forgotten from Yidden, so they gave a heter to put Torah Shebal Peh into writing. So here's where Chazal applied a pasuk, Eis Lasos Lashem Efeiru Teirasecha. It's a question of Eis Lasos, it's a question of rescuing Torah. Otherwise Torah will Chas v'Shalom be forgotten. So they tell us, Efeiru Teirasecha, we look aside at the fact that we know that until then this Inyan was not allowed to be put in writing. Here came a time when the Chachamim found it befitting to be it matter to be put into writing. The expression Hefeiru Teirasecha, the words in itself of Hefeiru Teirasecha, these are words which obviously are not so much, do not so express the concept of Mesayim and B'toiv. Why? Because it talks the contrary. It expresses Hefeiru Teirasecha. Torah is being tishter. Torah is not being full. In other words, we're looking away in Inyan and Torah. So that is why it is one of the Masechtas and Shas where Chazal discussed this pasuk. I don't really, the Rebbe mentioned which, I simply don't recall which. If somebody does, please speak up. Then the Gemara says, Amar Rav Nosson, Hefeiru Teirasecha mishum eis lasis Lashem. What does Rav Nosson say different than the Gemara which has just been discussed? So Mefarshei Talmud explained that this is Rav Nosson's idea. Rav Nosson's idea is he does not want that the Masechta should finish with the words of Hefeiru Teirasecha. Therefore, he explains, Mishum Hefeiru Teirasecha, you do in Yonim, you overlook in Yonim. In other words, that the last final word of the Masechta should not be words that express not an Inyan of Toif. In other words, whenever we conclude a Masechta, the conclusion must always be with an Inyan of Toif. Based on this cloud, where we see that even a Tana says an Inyan, that the whole idea of the Inyan is only because that the last finishing words of the Masechta should be words that finish b'toiv. The Rebbe brought the Rambam. And again, we know that in the Rambam everything is extremely accurate. At the end of Hilchos Isurei Bia in the Rambam stresses the greatness of tznius. Where is it? Here also concludes with an expression that by maintaining a house and proper tznius, this will keep it away from sin. However, the Rambam Taka uses the expression keep it away from sin, but again the Rambam is concluding with the word sin. So if we're looking for the klal of Mesayim and B'toiv, that the siyum of an inyan always has to be toiv, obviously the Rambam here, yes, it's the Rambam at the end of Hilchos Soita. Rambam expresses himself, V'chol mi she'eina makpid al ishtoi v'al banav u'bnei beisoi u'mazhiron, whoever is not careful, Apoikei drachein tomit, at sheyeda she'en shleimin, he should know that his family is complete, mekol chet ma'ovain, harei zechayte, this person is considered a sinner. Shenema, the Rambam quotes a pasuk, v'yadata ki shalom e'alecha, ufakadito noich v'loi sechte. In other words, if it's the obligation of a person to see to it that his house is kept in proper shape and on its nearest level. Otherwise, it chas v'shalom brings to sin. As well, the Rebbe found another Rambam, and this is the Rambam in Hilchos Tumah, where the Rambam also concludes with the words, the concept, in other words, the thought that the Rambam concludes with is a thought of toiv. However, the very last word which the Rambam closes these halachas is a word that expresses the contrary of toiv. Just like we find here, he concludes with the pasuk, "V'yodaita ki shalom alecha ufakadeto noich v'loi sechta." However, he's still completing with the word sechta, and sechta means a sin. How does this coincide with the klal of being Mesayim and B'toiv? So if the whole arichos, after a length explanation of what the Rebbe is coming to, the Rebbe says, it mustn't necessarily be that the word in itself, the very last word at the end of halachas or at the end of a mesechta, should be a word that is a siyum of toiv, as long as it's a concept of toiv. We do not look at the words, we look at it as a thought completely, as a thought incomplete, just like the Rambam here at the end of Hilchos Soita. Here the Rambam is completing, V'yadaita ki shalom e'alecha ufakadeto noich v'loi sechta. And the Rambam says, in this Masechta, where the Gemara completes, Amar Rab Nosson, Mishum eis lasis l'Hashem, Hefeiru teirasecha mishum eis lasis l'Hashem. So we see from the words of Rab Nosson, that Rab Nosson Taka does not want to complete the Masechta with the words of Hefeiru teirasecha. This is how most Mefarshei HaGemara learn. However, when we look into the Rambam's Pirush HaMishnayos on Gemara, and the Rambam there, it's the same Rambam who wrote these halachas. The Rambam there does not say that the reason Rab Nosson says different than the Tanakame is because that Rab Nosson wants to accomplish that the siyum should be with a perfect inyan of toiv. But again, getting back to the Rambam is takem makbid in his halachas to complete with an inyan, with a concept of toiv, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the words he completes with, the very last word in itself, also has to be a thought of toiv, a word of toiv, as long as the thought which is brought out at the closing of the inyan is a closing of toiv. The Mesechta is Mesechta Brachas, and it's the last Perek. The last Perek in Brachas is Perek Haroya. And this is what the Mishnah says. V'omer, there's another pasuk. Eis lasas Hashem efeiru teirasecha. Then comes Rab Nosson in this Mishnah. Rab Nosson omer, hefeiru teirasecha mishum eis lasas Hashem. So Mefarshim raised the question, why does Rab Nosson say different than the Tanakame? Actually, he's quoting the same pasuk. It's a pasuk in Tehillim Kuf Yutes. So they want to learn that Rab Nosson's inyan is, he does not want to finish the words of this Mishnah, which this is the conclusion of the Mishnah in Brachas, not Gemara but Mishnah, with the words of Efeiru Teiraseh. When it came to learn the Rashi in this week's Sedra, the Rebbe referred that he still did not complete the Rashi in last week's Sedra. And in last week's Farbrengen, the Rebbe raised the question in the Rashi of Vayeshev Yaakov, and due to shortage in time, the Rebbe did not give the response on the question. However, the Rebbe spoke, before he got involved into explaining the Rashi, the Rebbe said that what he really expected was that during this week, the discussion amongst people would be that people would be involved in trying to find the teretz on the kashu which he asked on last week's Rasha. And we know that there are these weekly publications, the Ha'oras Atmimim, that come out from various institutions, various yeshivas, which discuss in Yonim in the Rebbe Siches. Rebbe said that he was sure that he would find in the Ha'oras Atmimim people that would try to respond and find the teretz on the kasha which we walked away from last week's Farbrengen with. Rebbe says, on one hand, people give the impression that we're very, very anxious for the Rebbe to Farbring, and we cannot await the next forthcoming Farbrengen. And on the other hand, the Rebbe says, when he discusses such an inyan, and it says it's not a hard inyan, it's an inyan which something which applies to Pshuta Shel Mikra, it's something which everybody could really partake in. It's not real in depth in Yonim, it's not hard in Yonim. And at the same time, a week passed and he hasn't heard any comment from anybody. And the Rebbe says this raises second thoughts in his mind. Should he really take away so much time from such large groups of people, and take them away for 2.5, 3 hours Shabbos afternoon and sit and Farbring with them? He says perhaps these individuals, if they wouldn't be participating in the Farbrengen, Rebbe says he's sure they'd be doing other things. The Rebbe expressed himself, they would probably be sitting at home. So Rebbe said the Frierdiker Rebbe had an expression regarding a certain type of a drink. In Yiddish he used to refer to it as a tzigoria, some type of a warm drink. Or they would drink tzigoria, or they would drink tea, or coffee, or enjoy a Suda Shabbos. And at the same time the Rebbe says he's sure that they would be learning Chassidus, or learning in general. He says, years ago, there was a tremendous shortage in Svarim from the Rabbeim. There were not many in Yonim published from the Rabbeim. Today the Rebbe says as soon as a manuscript arrives, it's immediately suggested that it should be printed. The Rebbe says there's a tremendous amount of Mamorim printed today from the Alter Rebbe, as well as from the Mitteler Rebbe, from the Tzemach Tzedek, from the Rebbe Marash, from the Rebbe Nishma Seiden, as well as from the Frierdiker Rebbe. So if people wouldn't be participating in a Farbrengen, and he wouldn't Farbring, he's sure Yidden would be sitting and utilizing the time and learning these Mamorim. And the question arises, Rebbe expressed himself, Lama zeh anoichi. Why should he have to sit at Farbrengens and go through and learn in Yonim at the time he does not see a proper response and a proper interest from the Yolim? He referred to an expression from the Frierdiker Rebbe and his father, whereby they once came back from Italy, and that is when they saw trains running in a more sophisticated manner as it was in that day Russia, and they described it, used the expression that the locomotive is one unit and the train is another unit, and they could be attached and they could be not attached. The Rebbe applied this expression to this situation as well. In other words, there could be an attachment, and could be that the locomotive is one inyan and the train is another inyan, and chas v'shalom there's no attachment. And the Rebbe spoke at length. Why is it that there's no proper interest and no proper koch in these inyanim, and why nobody came up? The Rebbe says if somebody would want to say that he would want a prava anivus, and therefore he didn't put in a response into this ha'oras atmimim because he doesn't want nobody to know that he can come up with a proper teretz. The Rebbe says there are ways to circumvent that as well. You could have put in it, not putting your name under, signing your name. You could put your name into abbreviation, or you could put some other type of an abbreviation. However, the Rebbe says the inyan definitely has to be responded. I mean, we're into learning the inyanim and Rashi, and therefore the Rebbe says he will respond the question on last week's Rashi. Last week the Rebbe learned the Rashi at the beginning of Vayeshev. Beginning of Vayeshev, Rashi quotes many pirushim. One of them is a medrash. Medrash tells us, Bikesh Yaakov leishav b'shalva. Yaakov wanted to sit in peace. Kafatz alav rugzoi shel Yosef. The Rebbeinu did not allow him to sit in peace. And the Rebbeinu expressed himself, is it not enough for the tzaddikim that to get Olam Haba? They want to have peace on this world as well. So the Rebbe raised a very obvious question last week. The question is that the Rebbeinu Shalom has promised to Yaakov. The Rebbeinu told him, V'ata amarta heitiv heitiv imach. The Rebbeinu has pledged him that he will do good with him. So if the Rebbeinu committed himself to Yaakov, that he will do good with Yaakov, why is the Rebbeinu complaining now when Yaakov says Bikesh Yaakov leishe b'shalva. It is the Rebbeinu Shalom who was the one that promised him shalva. The Rebbeinu promised him that everything will be perfect, that he will have ata amalta heitev heitev imach, everything will be perfectly. Rebbe explained it today as follows. Yaakov was with Lavan for 20 years. After being with Lavan for 14 years, and Yosef was already born, Yaakov told Lavan that he wants to leave him. However, Lavan didn't agree to it as yet, and Yaakov remained with Lavan for an additional 6 years. So when Yaakov is leaving Lavan, how old is Yosef? Yosef is already 6 years old. When all the problems with Yosef began, when Yosef was sold and all the problems began, how old was Yosef at that age? Yosef was 17 years older. So how many years passed from Yaakov's leaving Lavan until the problems with Yosef, Kafetz olav Rugzei shel Yosef, until all this began? How many years passed? 11 years. As Yaakov left Lavan, he met Esav. And had the problems with Esav. And that is when the Rebbeinu Shalom promised him that the Ato Amalta Heitev Heitivim, the Rebbe pledged to him that he will not have any problems and he will be good to him. For all the years from Yaakov's leaving Lavan until the problems with Yosef, Yaakov had 11 peaceful years, almost 11 peaceful years. And this is a period which Yaakov utilized and was able to live and enjoy extremely peacefully. When did Ma'aseh Shechem happen? Afterwards. Probably pretty close to Esav's Ma'aseh. Obviously, because Shimon and Levi were 13 years old when it happened. That's how Chazal interpreted it. Shimon and Levi were quite a few years older than Yosef. So we must say that this happened probably the first year or so after him leaving Lavan. So from then until Rugzei shel Yosef, Yaakov sat back very peaceful. And the Rebbe says geographically, Yaakov was living near Esav. And though that Esav kissed him at the time when they met, however, we know that the hatred between from Esav to Yaakov was an extreme great one. As Rashi himself comments, that it was only Ba'isa Shah at that time, Esav was a little bit warm to Yaakov that they kissed each other. Memela, the Rebbe says, Yaakov had a period of peaceful years. The whole inyan of Yosef gained a tremendous knowledge from Yaakov. And whatever Yaakov had, we know in Yediyas HaTorah, knowledge, Yaakov turned over to Yosef. What should have been Yosef's inyan? Yosef's inyan should have been to go out and see to it and put influence on Esav and change Esav. Yosef, so as long as Yosef was a child, nothing could have been demanded from Yosef. But when Yosef reached the age of 17, and as the pasuk tells us, Yaakov shared all his knowledge, all his Yediyah b'Torah, shared it all with Yosef. So Yosef was already a person on his own. There's a pasuk, v'hoya beis Esav lekash ubeis Yosef lekash ubeis Esav l'lahava. In other words, the pasuk tells us, "Fakat beis Esav." Go ahead. Beis Esav lakash ubeis Yosef l'lahava. So in other words, the whole idea of Yosef is Yosef should have been the lahava. Yosef should have been the spark of fire, the lav, the fire that should have gone out, reached out, and correct Esav. And being that when the Rebbeinu Shalom saw the Va'ata was fulfilled for the many peaceful years which Yaakov had, here Yosef should have gone ahead and seen and do something with his uncle Esav. And the Rebbeinu Shalom realized that Yosef did not go ahead and did not try to change and have some sort of an impact, some sort of a hashpah on Esav, and Yosef was capable of having this hashpah, and being that Yosef didn't do it, that is why Rashi says, Kafetz olav Rugzei shel Yosef. This is why the whole problem which came into Yaakov's life was a problem that affected Yosef, that Yosef played a major role it involved Yosef. Why? Because Yosef at that time had an Inyan, had a shlichus, had a tafka to accomplish. And if Yosef didn't fulfill it, kafetz all the v'logzeh shel Yosef. This is to complete the Rashi in last week's Sedra. The Rashi in this week's Sedra is an Inyan, as the Rebbe does many times, a question, not a question in a Rashi, but it's a question in an Inyan which is so obvious that being that Rashi's Inyan is to explain Pshuta Shel Mikra, Rashi should have explained this Inyan as well. And for whatever reason, we see that Rashi passes the Inyan and does not say anything. And to such an extent that this is an Inyan which all Mefoshei HaTorah, who are Pashtonim, or not even Pashtonim, Darshonim, Mefoshim al Pidrash of Torah, they will raise this question. And this is, in Pashas Miketz, when Yosef is interpreting the dreams to Pari. And there Yosef says, V'al Hishonei Sachaloim. He explains to Pari why is it that the dream was repeated. Why did you have two types of dreams? This in itself is an indication that Memar Elokim La'asosei, that the Rebishter is going to do immediately the Inyan you dreamt about, as Yosef interpreted to him, and it's something which is going to take place very soon. All Mefoshim raise a tremendous question. The Torah finds it important here to interpret why the dream was repeated. Yosef himself also had two dreams, and in Parshas Vayeshev, and still there's no indication in the Torah in any way why Yosef had two dreams. So if the Torah didn't explain it in Parshas Vayeshev, Mela. But here, when it comes to Parshas Miketz, and we find a similar inyan, and there's attention given to the fact of Hishonei Sachaloim, and that Hishonei Sachaloim has some sort of a meaning, and an actual meaning, why isn't it that when the Torah tells us that Yosef had two chaloimis, at least Rashi should have commented, why did the Torah repeat Yosef's chaloimis twice? Rabbi says the Ramban asks this question, the Rashbam asks this question, Sefon asks the question, the Rachayim HaKodesh, everybody discusses this shaila. Rashi, whose Inyan is Pshuta Shel Mikra, does not mention anything. At the most, if Rashi didn't have any interpretation, Rashi should have at least raised the question and tell us Lo Yadaiti, as Rashi does several times in Chumash. He uses the expression Lo Yadaiti, because Rashi's Inyan is to point us out wherever there's an Inyan in Pshuta Shel Mikra which is not understood. And if here there is such an inyan, Rashi should have done the same. And this the Rebbe explains. In Pshuti Shel Mikra, the Rebbe says it's very simple. So simple that there was no need for Rashi to elaborate on it. Why? Paris two chaloimis. Though each of them, he sees a different object, however, the contents of the cholim is the same. Therefore, when Pari told Yosef the chaloimis, and Yosef is interpreting these chaloimis now to Pari, it is most appropriate for Yosef to stress V'alishonei Sachaloim, and to tell him that it means that the Rebbe is going to fulfill it immediately. In Parshas Vayeshev, if we look carefully into the two chaloimis, they are far from being identical chaloimis. Very far. In the first cholim, it's a cholim which is taking place in the field, where he's relating the cholim about the 11 bundles, referring to whom? To his brothers, and something which does not apply to his father and to his mother. That's one cholim. Second cholim involves different people. Second cholim is where we're telling about the Achadosa Kechavim, and also about the Shemesh V'Yereach. The Shemesh V'Yereach referring to his father and to his mother, that his father and his mother will be coming bound to him. So it's a cholim not only discussing, where he's talking about different objects, it's talking about different people. Here the cholim, one cholim involves his parents, the other cholim does not involve his parents. So it cannot be considered a type of a Hishonei Sachaloim, a cholim that was repeated. And we take see as the cholim was fulfilled. By Paroi, it's a Hishonei Sachaloim, and Hishonei Sachaloim, Yosef interprets, this means that the cholim is going to take place immediately. The interpretation of the cholim. By Yosef, it didn't take place immediately. Yosef had the dreams when he was 17 years old, This is when this Maisa took place. When was it that he met his brothers, and it was Achad also that, so to speak, the interpretation of the dream, that 11 bundles are bowing to him? This happened 13 years later. This happened when Yosef was 30 years old. So a tremendous amount of time elapsed between Yosef seeing the dream and when the dream came into a reality. It's two separate chaloimes. Other Meforshei HaTorah that are not that much bound into Pshuta Shel Mikra, and that's why they can raise the question. However, Rashi, whose Inyan is Takib, and only Pshuta Shel Mikra and Pshuta Shel Mikra, it's very obvious the difference between the two chaloimes Pari had and the two chaloimes Yosef had. The Rebbe referred again, which were discussed in the Farbrengen of Yitas Kislev and last Shabbos, whereby the Rebbe requests and asks each and every Yid that the beginning of the davening, the daily davening, should be with the words of Arini Mekabel Alai Mitzvaseh Shel V'ahavta L'Reyacha Kamoicha. And the closing of the davening should be with the pasuk of Ach Tzadikim Yoidu Lishmecha Yeshvu Yesharim Es Panecha. And the Rabbi referred to, as he discussed previously, this applies to those who are not davening Nusachari. This is no meaning whether one davens Nusachari or not. This simply comes as a response to the times we are living in. The Rabbi says we are living in a terrible time. It's a time where we see obviously how umois misgarai zu bezu, how big nations are involved one with another, and it is our inyan to do inyanim that chas v'sholem Yidden should not be harmed. The Rebbe says there are many eitzes what to do. One eitzah is to look into Torah and find advices in Torah to accept upon ourselves saying additional psukim, accepting upon ourselves additional inyanim, or just talking about the matzav. The Rebbe says talking about the matzav is not going to help. However, accepting upon ourselves to say these inyanim, this will definitely help and definitely bring to a Yeshua, as we have seen in Jewish history in the past. While talking about the inyan of Ach Tzadikim, Yedu Lishmecha, Yeshvu Yesharim Es Panecha, which, as the Rebbe explained in the previous Farbrengens, is a request that the Rebbe should bring our lives in a hisyashvus. In other words, we should be set safe without any interferences. The Rebbe says here we're talking about Yankov. When Yankov bikish leishav b'shalva, HaKadosh Baruch Hu considered it a crime. How are we asking now, Ach tzadikim yedu l'shmecha, yeshvu yisharem es panecha? Rebbe says, because the truth is, from then until now, we have gone through more than enough. If we look throughout the generations, whatever Klal Yisrael suffered plenty and plenty. Rebbe says that the Mittel Rebbe in his Mamorim writes that what Klal Yisrael suffered in Yemei HaBinayim, in the medieval days, in those generations, is more than enough that Yidden shouldn't have to suffer anymore. Now we could definitely ask the Rebbe for Ach Tzadikim Yodu Lishmecha Yeshvu Yesharim Es Panecha, that Yidden should be able to live in his yashvus without any type of interferences. Rebbe says that in Chazal there are two expressions. There's one expression, Umois Misgarai Zu Bezu, which the Gemara applies as a sign to the generation that when Mashiach will come, that the superpowers will be misgarais, will be involved one with another, will be in the milchama one with another, will be trying to show who is more powerful, one or the other. Misgara, the right translation of misgara is one is reitzing on the other. How would you say? Inciting. Probably. However, there is another expression in Medrash, Umois Misgarais Eilu Be'eilu, that amongst the nations there's an inyan of Tigro going on. Rebbe says that when the Sikha was prepared, those that prepared the text quoted Umois Misgarais Eilu Be'eilu. The Rebbe says, however, he was correct, accurate in using the expression zu bezu, because what is concerning us now is primarily that Yidden should not be hurt by the world situation. The world situation is not a good one, far from being good, and our prime concern is that it should not have any effect on Yidden chas v'shel. Memele umis mizgari zu bezu, we are talking about two superpowers one with another. Umis mizgaris elu be'elu means there are many umis and such that may not in any way have any shaykhs with Yidden. Many ummahs that are mizgarais zu bezu. So the Rebbe says that is why he rather chose to use the expression ummahs mizgarais zu bezu rather than elu be'elu, because zu bezu talking about superpowers, which definitely has an effect on Yidden. And this singular, one with another, rather than many against these with those. Talking about this Inyan, the Rebbe again began talking very, very strongly about the Matzav in Eretz Yisrael. The Rebbe referred to his opinion, which he has expressed at many occasions. And the Rebbe says we see the bitter mistakes which were made by the Camp David peace agreement. The Rebbe says the agreement could have definitely been made, and not for such type of giveaways which Eretz Yisrael gave away. Eretz Yisrael gave away in Yonim, which are extremely vital to the existence of Klal Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael gave away Sinai, one part of Sinai, another part of Sinai, and the unfortunate part of it is that Eretz Yisrael would be even willing to give more. If Mitzrayim would take, Eretz Yisrael would give more, just that there's some hashgacha pratis that Mitzrayim didn't take more. But as far as Eretz Yisrael is concerned, they are willing to give away more and more. Gave away Yamit. At the time there was a commitment made to Yidden that Yidden will never be driven out of Yamit. And the response to this was that the commitment was made at Camp David that Yamit would be given away. The Rebbe says, if one should go and make a shvuah, b'nekitas chayfetz, the highest type of shvuah possible, if a person will accept upon himself to do something which will be harmful and detrimental, and will bring a sakana to the existence of Yidden, are we going to say that just because he took it upon himself that he has to fulfill it? Chas v'chalila. I went so far as saying that if, I didn't mention him by name, but obviously referring to Begin at that time, that if Begin wouldn't have agreed to put into writing all the agreements and all the giveaways which he gave away by Camp David, the Camp David agreement would have taken place regardless. And he says, even if Begin would have picked himself up and left to Eretz Yisrael, he would have been called back on a red carpet, he used this expression, as long as, because at that time the prime interest of America and Egypt was to have some sort of an agreement put into writing. And each of the countries needed it for their elections. And the question, what in detail is put into the agreement, would not have any type of an effect on the elections of either one of the countries, as long as a peace agreement would have been made. And unfortunately now we see the results and the consequences which came from this agreement as well as from other agreements. And here the Rebbe pointed out what happened this week, whereby thousands of PLO terrorists were given back in exchange for 6 Yiddish terrorists. The Rebbe said it does not, chas v'sholem, 6 Yiddish soldiers, 6 Yidden. The Rebbe used the expression, it does not in any way, what he's talking does not in any way minimize or underestimate the importance of these 6 individuals. No question that they had to be rescued. However, not in a format of such type of concessions and giving away, which Yisrael gives away constantly. And this is the same approach, one failure after failure. It's the same failures which were done after the 6 Day War, the same failures were done in the Yom Kippur War, and the same failures are constantly being repeated day after day. And these are failures which are, and errors which are putting millions of Yidden into sakana. And this is something which the Rebbe spoke in detail about when the Milchama began in Lebanon. The Rebbe says at that time the United States would have been more than happy that the Yidden, when they entered Lebanon, they had the power, and what they were able to do was to totally destroy the PLO. They were able to get them all out of Lebanon at that time, get them into Algiers, into another type of country, and this would have forbidden many, many problems. So at that time, when the Rebbe says, when he was begging that Eretz Yisrael should not remain in the middle of the job, the Rebbe says, we find in the Torah by Eliyahu HaNavi. Eliyahu HaNavi, when he was criticizing Klal Yisrael, what was the strongest critic he put upon them was that they are peischim al shtei hasifim. Eliyahu HaNavi told the Yidden, either they follow Hashem, if they don't follow Hashem, let them follow the Baal. And ultimately they will realize that the Baal is no Inyan following, so they will return to Hashem. and not stick to Avodah Zarah. The worst crime that can be committed is when one is a Pesach al Shtei Asifim, meaning he's dancing on both chasanas. In other words, the Yidden in that time were hanging on to Hashem, and they were hanging on to the Baal. And this is something which Eliyahu was trying to prove to them. This is the worst type of a belief which a person can have within himself. Same the Rebbe says, they was involved in a Milchama in Lebanon. Hundreds of Yidden were killed in Lebanon. In other words, it's something we were in a Milchama. And at the same time, the Milchama was not completed. And this is something which never should have came to such a situation. If we already got into the Milchama, and it's a Milchama where so much Yiddish blood was shed, then the Milchama should have definitely been completed. And if the Milchama wasn't completed, we did not do our job. And if we didn't do our job, all the negotiations which are going on since are not being done in the proper manner, and the complete approach that Eretz Yisrael should give so much away, constantly giving away. Here he spoke again, that when Sinai was being given away back to Mitzrayim, it is the oil wells which were given away. The oil wells are something which are extremely important and detrimental to the existence of Eretz Yisrael, and such vital inyanim were given away. And again, all of this is done. There is one reason for all of this. The reason is that the people who are involved in the negotiations are lacking the Ga'oin Yankov. They are lacking the proper Jewish pride. And being that this is discussed in Chanukah, if we look back into history in Chanukah, there were also these type of Yidden. They were the Yidden who were called the Misyavnim. They wanted to act as Yevonim. They wanted to act as the Greeks of those days. Basically, what was the shit of the Misyavnim? They didn't deny Yiddishkeit, they didn't deny the existence of the Jewish people. Their philosophy was, Yehudi b'veisecha, true to be a Yid, but we're to be a Yid only at home. The Adam b'teisecha, this was the same philosophy which was preached by the Maskilim as well. True to be a Yid, but to be a Yid only at home. It comes on the outside, and when we're involved with other people, we're involved with Yidden are involved with other nations as well. There we have to act as one of them. And this, the Rebbe says, this is the clue, and this is what leads to all these tremendous failures and all these tremendous errors. When Yidden who are involved in these type of negotiations are lacking the proper Ga'oin Yaakov, the proper Yiddish stolz, the proper Jewish pride, then Chas v'Shalom they keep on making constantly these mistakes, error after error, and look away after such vital inyanim which are mamish inyanim of pikuach nefesh and are mamish negeh to the existence of Klal Yisrael. And the Rebbe concluded that let us hope that through the inyanim of accepting upon ourselves this v'ahavta l'reyacha kamoicha, saying this before davening, harini mekabel alai mitzvah sasei shel v'ahavta l'reyacha kamoicha, this will lead to a reality of Avas Yisrael, not only to Avas Yisrael, but to the full unity of Yidden, which, as the Rebbe keeps on referring to recently, Achdus Yisrael, a total unity amongst Yidden. And this will correct and destroy the Sinas Chinam, which was prevalent amongst Yidden, which this led to the Churban HaBayis, and this led to all of the problems of Golas, the Inyanim of Avas Yisrael, and spreading this concept of Avas Yisrael will lead to it that from Avas Yisrael until Achdus Yisrael, this will bring to the Gula Shleima the Mashiach Tzidkenu.
Amen.
That it should be peace on Yidden. Yidden should live in a hisyashvus.
But when you have to tell them about the truth this time, I mean, to be described with this.
You reminded me, I wanted to get back to it.
Say Chach now.
Nicht verfallen, right? But discussed. Forgot more than one. How we have to be, was reminded another Indian how we have to be involved in doing mitzvahs. However, at the same time, when we do mitzvahs, there are different types of mitzvahs, and the mitzvahs have to be done with the proper intention. And the Rebbe said that there's an Kabbalah soil, and the Rebbe referred that there's an expression of seeing. So it's a whole story which is referred to in a maim of the Frierdiker Rebbe, how the Baal Shem Tov once showed his Talmidim how an individual was sitting and eating Suda Shabbos. And he was eating Suda Shabbos, and the Talmidim saw not a person, but the Talmidim saw an ox, a shoyer and a shtreimbel. And it was explained by the Baal Shem at the time that this was an individual who was involved in eating Suda Shabbos. And Al Pi Halacha, it's supposed to be so. Suda Shabbos, the Rebbe elaborated today. When we eat it, one eats it to the best extent. He enjoys it with basar shamein, v'yayin yasha, and a good piece of meat, and a good cup of wine, and this is how he's properly enjoying a Suda Shabbos. However, when we're too much involved in it, and we forget that what we're really out for is a Suda Shabbos, which is a mitzvah of the Rebishter, and ultimately we get involved in it a little bit too much, we get involved over our heads into it, and what we are out for is to really enjoy the good piece of meat, and enjoying the good cup of wine which we are drinking with it. Then we see the individual who's wearing a shtraimel, which is a Beged Shabbos. However, at the same time, we're not seeing him as a person, we're seeing him as an axe. Why? Because he's totally lost himself and his identity that he's doing this L'Shem Mitzvah Shabbos and doing this L'Shem Mitzvah which the Rebishter wants we should enjoy as Suda Shabbos. However, all this is forgotten from him and he's totally involved in the type of the eating it. A gute Woche, a freiliche Chaneke. One other Inyan at the end of the Farbrengen, at the end of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe referred that there was an ad in this week's Yiddish newspaper in the Allgemeine Journal, an ad telling Yidden about the importance of saying Hareini Mekabel Alai Mitzvah Shel V'Ahavta L'Reyacha Kamoicha before davening and concluding davening with Ach Tzadikim Yodu L'Shmecha. The Rebbe expressed that he was extremely satisfied to see this ad, and particularly that the way the ad was set up, that there was a little coupon by the side of the ad which has the imprint of these words, the words of Hareini Mekabel and Ach Tzadikim, which allows these words to be cut out so that people who daven in different Sidurim, not Nusach Hari Sidurim, and do not have these words in their Siddur, so they should be able to cut out these two lines and be able to paste it into their Siddur. The Rebbe said that he's extremely thankful and appreciative for, even before he even suggested to put it into the papers, that this Inyan was publicized, and he's asking that in the future as well to see to it, to reach out to all Yidden and publicize this in such type of formats, whether they should be able to put it into a siddur or different ways, as long as Yidden should get involved in the Inyan of Avas Yisrael, accepting upon themselves and fulfilling the Inyan of Avas Yisrael, which is so important in our times. A gute Woche and a freiliche Chaneke.